that's good.
He drove the biggest part for it. Good morning, good morning.
I'm not editing this out either, so people. I'm not editing this out.
I'm just glad for who you're not gonna have today. I'm taking it off.
We are too.
It was good. It was fast, but it was good.
It says in here fast track.
Yeah. Well, we left at 4 o'clock Friday afternoon at the base. Got back last night about, what was it, about 9? We got in at 30.
9:33.
We was on the road or in the cemetery, one of the two.
Wow.
Very lively trip. It was a very lively trip.
Well, he was in the road or either in the cemetery, is what he said.
I was going to made it lively. That's what I was.
Well, we sure wasn't in the cemetery.
Oh, yeah. That's exactly right.
Yeah, Carl said
I didn't even go by and see them. We drove around.
Paris pretty lively on some occasions.
Him and Mother slept the whole time.
So much for lively.
I just put my headphones in and listened to music.
You were driving?
Yeah. Well, good morning, everybody. It's about time to begin. If you want to, we're going to be looking at a couple of different passages this morning. So if you want to mark Luke chapter 5 and John chapter 21, we're going to be flipping back and forth between the two a decent bit this morning. So if you just want to stay open to those two, that's primarily where we're going to be. One quick announcement I did want to make for my class. I have updated the schedule that I handed out last week primarily because the date of VBS changed, so I updated the schedule to reflect that. I've got a new schedule on the bulletin board. If you want a paper copy, just ask me for it. I've got a few here. But tonight we are going to have our kickoff, our summer kickoff Devo. And our topic this summer is I have decided to follow Jesus. And I've got several events planned throughout the summer. And I'm looking forward to that. But if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask me. I do have several guest speakers lined up for our Devo. So it's not necessarily going to be me talking every time. So I think that's a positive. But anyways, yeah, like I said, if you need a paper copy, I've got some printed out. Just let me know. Let's pause this morning for a prayer. Dear God, we come before you this morning praising your holy name, understanding that you have given us everything there is, everything that we have, everything that we are. And dear God, we pray that you would be with us at this hour as we dive into your holy word, understanding that this is how you communicate with us today. And we pray that the things we read about and study about from your word are things that we can take and apply to our lives and make ourselves better. We ask these things through your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen. A couple of weeks ago, we were doing, we're getting ready to hire a new full-time English teacher at work. And so we were doing several interviews, and with the full-time English teachers, one thing they're required to do whenever they interview for the job is they have to do a teaching demo. And I had to do it, and it's a little kind of a mix of awkward, but it's really there to give the panel an idea of how the person's going to teach when they're in the classroom. And so we did that with a person a couple of weeks ago, and I really enjoy when I get to watch other English teachers teach, because usually what that does, it reminds me that I have a lot of growing to do. And in one case in particular, there was one lady who interviewed for the job, and she did a compare and contrast. She did a simple lesson on comparison and contrast. And I was sitting there and I was thinking, well, this is brilliant. I'm stealing this and using it in my class.
Commandeer. Teachers commandeer. We don't steal.
That's
we
true.
commandeer.
That's a good point. It's not plagiarizing. So I said I'm going to take this and use it, and I'm not going to be doing her lesson on comparison and contrast, but I am going to be doing a comparison and contrast today for our Bible class lesson. And kind of the focus, the purpose of comparison and contrast is just so that we can kind of learn something. And I like to tell my students, we compare things way more than they realize. For example, if you're just simply online shopping something with Amazon and you're trying to decide, am I going to buy product A, product B, that involves comparison. When you're going car shopping, that involves comparing. You want to look at, things, certain features that one car has, something that maybe another one has, and you want to make the best decision possible. Well, this morning I want us to do a comparison of two miracles of Jesus. And these miracles that we're going to be looking at this morning are very similar. They're actually pretty much kind of the same thing. But there's a couple of unique things that happens with these two miracles that I think is really important to look at. And I want us to do a comparison and contrast of a miracle that Jesus did in Luke chapter 5 and in John chapter 21. Now, here's something that's really important to understand when we're comparing these two miracles. Now, the miracle that we see in Luke chapter 5 and John 21 are basically Jesus is doing the exact same thing. Okay? That is, of course, the miracle of the disciples were out fishing. They hadn't caught anything. Jesus told them to lower their nets again, and then they had an abundance of fish. And so that's really what's happening in both of these miracles, both of these chapters. And there's a couple of key, I think, significant differences that I want us to spotlight when we're looking at these two miracles. The first thing I want us to understand is the difference between calling and recalling. Now you may be thinking, well, what do you mean by that? Well, it's important to understand that in Luke chapter 5, this is basically a miracle that's happening as Jesus is first calling the disciples to their ministry. And, when you read through the four Gospels, each Gospel gives an account of Jesus calling his disciples. Now, when we're looking at Matthew and Mark, we see a very similar story or a very similar thing happen. Jesus just simply tells them, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Now, in Luke, we get a little bit more information, and in John, we also get a little bit of a different piece of information when Jesus is first calling the disciples. And there's some differences between the ways that Jesus calls them, and I think we can kind of draw to the conclusion that when we're looking at these four stories, they may have not necessarily all happened at the same time, because especially in John, there's kind of a before Jesus calls them story that we get. And in Luke, we see this miracle that is there to kind of serve for this purpose of, letting the disciples know the power that Jesus has. And we're going to look at that in a little bit. But in John chapter 21, like I said, pretty much the same miracle is happening. However, it's at the end of Jesus' time in his ministry. Luke chapter 5 is at the beginning. This is his initial calling of the disciples. But John 21 is what I like to call a recalling. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Let's look at Luke chapter 5, and I'm going to begin reading with verse 1 here. And we'll get a look at the actual miracle that's happening here. It said, on one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land, and he sat down and taught the people from the boat. Just kind of stopping right here. Jesus did this actually multiple times. He taught from boats. This is just one occasion where we see that happen. On one occasion, they were essentially kind of like on a beach, and the crowd was so vast that Jesus got into the boat and so that he could teach them from the boat. But he did this multiple times. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, for their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus answered to Simon, "Do not be afraid, from now on you will be catching men." And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. So this is the initial this is a miracle that goes along with the initial calling of the disciples. And we see here that these men literally left everything behind. And I believe it's in Matthew and in Mark, the word used is immediately. Okay? And we see here, we kind of get an example of how dedicated people followed Jesus during this time. They literally left behind their families, left behind their jobs, which is something that I think most of us today probably wouldn't do, if that makes sense. We have a hard time just putting things behind us so that we can do what it is that we know we need to. So this is the initial call. Now, however, in John 21, like I said, this is what I would call a recalling of the disciples. Now, the question then comes up is, why did the disciples have to be recalled? And there's a couple of scriptures. Turn over to Matthew chapter 26. There's a couple of scriptures I want us to look at. But in the case of the disciples, it was necessary for them to be recalled simply because they had all abandoned Jesus. And here in Matthew chapter 26, let's begin reading with verse 56. There's a little bit more I want to read, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. But this is Jesus speaking. He says, "But this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all of the disciples left him and fled." So not only did the disciples abandon Jesus, but it was prophesied. And we're going to look a little closer at one of the verses in a few minutes. But they had all left Jesus. So this is essentially, in John 21, essentially a recalling of the disciples because they had all fled, as we see here. Now, the one disciple that we get the most information from about his leaving Jesus was Peter. So if you're still in Matthew chapter 26, skip down a few verses to verse 69. And like I said, this is something that we just get more information about Peter and his abandonment of Jesus. And Jesus told him he was going to deny him 3 times. And here's where we actually see him do that. Starting with verse 69 of Matthew 26, it says, "Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, you also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before them, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him and said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, saying, "I do not know the man." After a little while, and that would be when it says he denied it with an oath, probably how we would say something like, "I swear I don't know this guy," is probably what that's referring to. "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you." And I think this is a very telling thing that sometimes we don't think about, is that people should be able to tell that we are Christians by the way we carry ourselves, by the way we talk, by the way we act. And in this case, they understood just from the way Peter talked, they knew he had been with Jesus. Because he had been with Jesus for some time and he had been imitating Jesus. And his accent, and as some versions say, betrayed him in this particular case. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Now, again, this was something that Jesus had specifically told Peter that very night. Look back a few verses. This is still in Matthew 26, beginning with verse 31. And this is also the prophesying that not just Peter, but all of them. And for some reason, we get more information on Peter's abandonment of Jesus. It said, "When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and Jesus said to them, you will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter answered him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." So Peter was the one who spoke up after Jesus had prophesied this, essentially saying, "You're wrong. This isn't going to happen. They may do it. I won't." And he makes another really bold statement in verse 35, but we'll read 34 first. It said, Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And it says that the others said the same thing. But one thing I think we really learn from this is that Jesus is always right. Even though Peter felt that he was right here, he believed that he was correct. He believed that that what he said, and I don't think he just said this for the sake of saying it. I think he believed it, but Jesus knew what would actually happen when when put on the spot like Peter was. He knew that he would ultimately deny him. So we see that all of the disciples, not just Peter, like I said, we really only get a more complete story of what he did that night, but all of the disciples had abandoned Jesus. So there was a necessary recall in John 21. Turn over there right now, John 21. And I think what we see here is kind of a further departure from Jesus. In verse 3 of John 21, it said, Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." And they said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, and that night caught nothing. So, when Jesus is first called, when the disciples are first called, what are they doing? They're literally fishing. So what are they doing in this case? They're going out fishing. Now, can we say for a fact that this is them saying, we're going back to what we knew before? Okay. I can't say if this is a complete abandonment of their faith. I don't think so. But what we do know is Peter makes this statement, I'm going fishing. The others said, we're going too. They were going back to what they knew. They were going back to that boat, and we don't know how often they fished during the time they were on their ministry with Jesus. We don't really read about it too many times, or we really don't read about it in the gospel accounts, but we see them going back. They'd already forsaken Jesus the night he was killed. They had all fallen away that night, just like Jesus said. And now it seems that they're, kind of going back to where they were when Jesus first called them. And it's almost like, well, their mission when Jesus was with them on earth, it's almost like, well, it's over now. What now? What are we supposed to do? But the limited commission that they were given initially by Jesus, that Jesus was with them, was in fact over. But Jesus had much greater plans for these men moving forward. And I think there are plenty of places in the Bible, I think specifically in the beginning of the book of Acts, that shows that the disciples didn't quite understand exactly what it was Jesus wanted them to do. And so they didn't have full understanding. But they're here, and they're here, they're out fishing, and then suddenly they see someone walking on the shore who they didn't know who it was. And this actually happened quite a few times when Jesus was presenting himself to people after he arose from the grave. There were times where people would be talking with Jesus. There were times where he would be around people for a decent amount of time, and they didn't know who it was they were with. They just thought it was some stranger. And that happened multiple times over, during the times Jesus presented himself to the disciples. And this was one of those one of those cases where they didn't know initially who it was standing on the shore in front of them. So let's take a look at the two miracles themselves and kind of compare what some commonalities that we see between both miracles. Number one, the first thing we note is that in both cases, both of these times, the disciples were fishing and had absolutely nothing. Okay, and we read that earlier in Luke chapter 5, but in John chapter 21, beginning with verse 4, it said, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? They answered, no. So we see this, one thing I read refers to as a drought of fishes, okay, in both of these cases. They had been fishing and they hadn't had any luck. It sounds like when me and Alan go fishing, we never catch anything, okay? In fact, it would be a shock if we actually do catch something. I mean, it's that bad. But in both cases, they hadn't caught anything. And in both of these cases, they saw great results, okay? So in the Luke chapter 5, which we just read, they had so many fish that, of course, the nets were breaking and they had to get their partners to put the fish in the boat. Let's look at the results here in John 21. He said, this is beginning with verse 6. He said, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When we're out fishing, we'll throw that line anywhere we can if we see a bubble and got to reel it in, throw out there. But typically how it works is if the fish aren't biting right here, they're probably not going to be biting right here either. And that's what we kind of see, there's in Luke chapter 5, when Jesus tells them to put out their nets, he said, we've been here all night, caught nothing, but at your command I will. And here they put the net on the right side of the boat, whether right or left. You would think, well, if nothing's on the left, there's probably nothing on the right either. But that's not exactly what happened. It said, so they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. And actually, we are given account of how many fish they caught. If you skip down to verse 11, we're told that they caught 153 fish. We would be, well, Alan was happy that, didn't you catch a snapping turtle one time?
Yeah,
or a turtle one? Yeah, he was happy when he caught a turtle. And, but, we'd just be happy to catch anything. But they had 153 fish. And this was a massive result. Both times in these miracles, they prospered, not because of themselves, but because they obeyed Jesus. In Luke chapter 5, verse 4, Jesus gave the command to put out their nets, into the deep. In John 21:5, he said, put out your net on the right side of the boat. Now, had they thought, no, there's no fish over there, I'll put it on the left side, this wouldn't have happened, They saw great results because they obeyed Jesus. And I think that's something that's really important for us to remember, is that if Jesus gives a command, it's the following of the command that brings results, not necessarily the act itself. So, in both miracles, we see a really interesting response from Peter in both occasions. Turn back to Luke chapter 5. I know we read this earlier, but I want to take a look at it. Peter's response in Luke chapter 5 was, Jesus, get away from me. I am not worthy to be around you. That was his response. Beginning with verse 8, it said, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said, do not be afraid. Peter's initial response was, get away from me, because I'm not worthy to be around you. I'm not worthy to be around this man who has been prophesied. Why me? Why me? Why is it me that is here with you, that is being called by you? This is a very different, in John 21, we see a very different reaction from Peter. His initial reaction in Luke 5 was, get away from me. But let's see what he does in John 21. Verse 7, it said, that disciple whom Jesus loved, which is referring to John. And in fact, at the end of this chapter, he identifies himself. Throughout this book is not written necessarily from a first-person point of view until kind of the very end of the chapter, where John actually does acknowledge who he is, that he is the disciple that Jesus loved. But it was John who first sees that and first realizes that, oh, this is Jesus. Who else could make something like this happen? It is the Lord, he said. Now notice Peter's response. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. So literally, initially his response was, get away from me. And now his response is, I have to get to Jesus as fast as I can. Now, if we look down in verse 8, it says, the other disciples came in from the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards. So basically this tells us that Peter, what he did was, When he realized it was Jesus, he jumped out of that boat, swam to him as fast as he could. About a football field's length, about 100 yards is what Peter swam to get to Jesus. So I think it's interesting to see the growing on Peter's account over most people believe around 3 years. In the beginning it was, I'm not worthy. Get away from me, I'm not worthy. But now it's, I have to get to Jesus. So I think this is a really interesting thing that we see happen, his response. Both times, with both of these stories, Jesus told the men to follow him. And I think that's a really important message that we need to think about today. When Jesus gives the command to follow him, it's our responsibility to do that. Now, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, when Jesus first called them, when he first said, follow me and I will make you fishers of men, he's saying follow me in a very literal sense. That is, leave everything, you're going to go where I'm going right now. Okay? This is a very literal following of Jesus. And Jesus, he had a journey he was beginning when he called the disciples. He had a purpose for calling them. And he wanted them to follow him everywhere he went and do everything he did, see everything he did. And he was essentially training these men for when he would ultimately be leaving them. Now, whether they realize that or not is up in the air. I know there are some cases that we read about in the Bible where we certainly see they didn't understand some of the things Jesus was telling them or some of the things that Jesus was doing. So, I think the disciples' response to Jesus when he told them to follow him at the beginning of his ministry is something we need to pay close attention to. Look at Matthew chapter 4, beginning with verse 20. Let's read verse 19 first. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Verse 20, immediately, straight away. Whatever the version of your Bible says, it shows that it was something that happened instantly. They followed Jesus immediately, right there. Skip down to verse 22. When James and John was called to follow Jesus, the response is the same, immediately. In Mark chapter 1, verses 18 and 20, we see that same thing, immediately. That's their response. They immediately followed Jesus. And that sets a good precedent for us. When we are called upon by Jesus, it requires action. And not just action, but it requires often immediate action. Now, in John 21, look at verse 19. Jesus is telling Peter to follow me. One more time. Really, this is the last time we have recorded of Jesus telling Peter to follow him. Now, in this case, this is a very different type of follow me than the first follow me, so to speak. This is not a literal following of Jesus. But verse 19, it says here, after saying this, and we'll go back to what this was in a few minutes, he said to him, follow me. Now, like I said, this is not a literal follow Jesus. In fact, if you turn back to John chapter 13, verse 36, Jesus actually tells the disciples before, let's see. Beginning with verse 32, it says, if God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while I'm with you. You will seek me, just as I've said to the Jews. So now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. And so they were already told that they would not be literally following Jesus here. Where I'm going, you can't follow behind. Where was Jesus going? Well, he told them in John chapter 14 that he was going to prepare a place for them with God. But at this specific time, they would not be literally following Jesus. This final follow me, well, technically it's not the final follow me if you continue reading, but this last time Jesus is saying follow me, it's more of a now you're going to do the things that I've asked you to do. You're going to be continuing this work. You're not going to literally be following me to heaven when I ascend to heaven. In Acts chapter 1, we see Jesus ascend into heaven. They are not literally following him there. But they would be following him later. So, Jesus was about to leave them. They were not going to literally follow Jesus this time. But they would be following sometime later. But something really interesting happens near the end of John 21. We see an encounter happen between Peter and Jesus, beginning with about verse 15. I'm going to read verse 15 through 18 real quickly. It said, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? That's an interesting question. What could these have been referring to? Do you love me more than these other men here? Do you love me more than fishing? Do you love me more than this, what you were doing before I walked up this morning? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. And he said a second time, Simon, son of John, you love me? And he said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. And he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, you love me? It says Peter was grieved because he had said to him a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Why would have Peter been grieved because he asked him this 3 times? Is there a certain symmetry, certain connection that we can make? Jesus is asking him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Well, this isn't an accident. This isn't a coincidence. In fact, not many days before, Peter had said 3 times, I do not know the man. You know, we see a certain symmetry here. It's not an accident that Jesus is asking Peter this 3 times. It's not an accident that we see pretty much the same miracle happen at the beginning of their ministry and at the end of the ministry. There's a lot of symmetry that we see happen throughout the Bible. And it's not by accident. Now, this conversation that Jesus and Peter have here means so much less in our language than it does in the original Greek. And the reason for that is because there are multiple words for the word love in Greek, whereas we only have 1 word. But the 4 different words that they use for love in Greek have 4 different meanings. And there are 2 used here. One is agape, which is the greatest love, this all-consuming love that God has for us. The second one is phileo. Think in terms of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Phileo is this kind of kindred, brotherly, friend spirit. So when we're actually looking at this conversation here, Jesus twice uses the word agape. The first time in in John 15, 21, verse 15, when he says, Simon, son of Jonah, do you agape me more than these? However, when Peter responds, he says, yes, Lord, I phileo you. So what we see here is how we might put it in our context is, Peter, do you love me? Well, I care for you. I like you, Lord, is kind of how that might translate a little better. Second time, Jesus says, do you agape me? And again, Peter responds, I phileo you. However, the third time when Jesus uses this word, he says, do you phileo me? Now, this is significant. 2 times Jesus said agape. And the third time is when Jesus is kind of bringing it down to Peter's level. This is a love that at the current moment, Peter isn't quite capable of. Now, if he was having this conversation with Peter, who wrote the book of 2 Peter, I think the wording would be completely different. But Peter wasn't quite there yet. So I think that's important for us to see today, that there's a lot of growing that we have to do. Jesus is bringing it down to Peter's level that he was at this time. And, that's how it is with us. There are, quite honestly, some things that we're just not capable of when we first decide to follow Jesus. There are some things that we're not capable of when we decide to follow Jesus. So this is a very interesting conversation that we have here. And verse 18, it says, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you were old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to be, where you do not want to go. He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to glorify God. So basically, Jesus here is foretelling the future. He doesn't say it in this exact language, but he's saying, you're going to die for me. And Jesus knew this. Peter is being informed. Now, we don't know, the Bible does not tell us exactly how Peter died. But there are some secular recordings of history that teach that Peter was crucified, just like Jesus. And when there were, when people were crucified, there were generally 3 types of crosses that would be used. You had the capital T, you had the lowercase t, which is the one that we most associate with the cross, and then you have the X. And historians believe that Peter was crucified on the X cross, which, if you play the PlayStation like me, I just found out a few weeks ago that they say the X button is actually supposed to be called cross, but that's irrelevant. But anyways, historians also teach that Peter was crucified upside down because he said that he wasn't worthy to be crucified in the same manner as Jesus. Now, the Bible doesn't teach this. This is secular history. So then again, the answer is we really don't know. We do know he was killed for Jesus' sake. And it's interesting that Peter asks Jesus one more question near the end of the chapter. It said, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had also leaned back against him during the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said, Lord, what about this man? He was like, what about this? What about him? What about John? And Jesus here kind of rebukes Peter, saying, he's not your concern. You follow me. You don't follow what John is doing. I've got different plans for him. And he said that, Jesus said, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. And I think that's something that's really important for us to remember. And I think a good place to end this lesson, that our focus should be on simply following Jesus. He's saying, he's not your concern. Don't worry about what he's doing. You follow me. Thank you.